Hello, Dan Alasso again with History for Today. And today I want to return to another chapter of Sönke Ahrens' book, How to Take Smart Notes. And this one will be on chapter 12. I was going to try to do the last few chapters of Ahrens' book together, but I find that I have a lot that I want to say about chapter 12. So I'm going to do it separately. So in this 12th chapter called Develop Ideas, Ahrens begins by quoting Niklas Luhmann once again, saying, "Every note is just an element in the network of references and back references in the system, from which it gains its utility." And this is a useful reminder that all of our notes, and by extension, all of our knowledge, are valuable mostly, and possibly only, because they fit together in this web of knowledge that we're building out of them. The Slipbox or the Obsidian Vault or the Rome Research Graph or the Evernote database are all very visible expressions of this. But I think the point is that it's an externalization and an expansion of something that we're already doing naturally in our heads as we integrate new ideas. The additional value of these tools, like writing and reading in general, when you think about it, is that it makes it possible to concentrate on more information. So we don't have to walk around a memory palace or create a story or an epic poem to do it. In the pre-literacy world of oral knowledge, that's why compelling narratives and poetry were developed, remember. Their beauty was a bonus. They were initially about remembering. Ahrens begins with a description of the mechanical process of numbering notes and putting new notes behind older related notes. This seemingly random placement of notes in a physical box allowed Luhmann to avoid the hierarchy that he believed, and Ahrens agrees, would have stifled his creative thought process and limited, or at least predetermined, the connections that he found between ideas. The alternating number-letter sequences theoretically allowed Luhmann to branch out into an infinite number of sequences and subsequences internally with no hierarchical order. Those are Ahrens' words. And as I reread this, it occurs to me that the point is not so much that the notes lack order, but that there's no predetermined structure that I'm fitting the ideas into, so that an order based on the logic of the connections between the ideas can emerge. This is not the same thing as disorder. But in any case, I agree when Ahrens says, this time he's citing Schmidt, that a note or a sequence that attracts more follow-up notes over time can become what he calls a main topic. This is similar to creating maps of content, but to creating them after a volume of notes accumulates, rather than trying to predefine top-level folders and topics at the beginning of the process. Ahrens describes this Luhmann process as being better than one-dimensional organizational structures like top-down topics and abstracts. I think this is true, but I suspect that he's still describing only a two-dimensional process, which may actually be a limitation built into the paper slipbox method. The slips, while they're in the box, exist in this higher dimensional matrix. But then when we take them out and put them in order, the waveform kind of collapses as we develop a text. This is a kind of an unavoidable result, I think, of making that two-dimensional path through a four-dimensional forest. A note here. A path or a line actually has only one physical dimension, length, but it has the additional dimension of time if you're walking the path. And a forest has three dimensions, length, width, and height, but it also has the fourth dimension because it changes over time. So the Obsidian graph for me allows me to visualize this web and maybe follow one branch and then return to follow another. So although I agree with Ahrens that the note system is the medium that we think in rather than something that we think about, I also think it's possible to think about our thinking. And the electronic graph may help me see that thinking in a higher dimensional form. Ahrens' point is still a powerful one, though. The system actually is our thinking, externalized, in the same way that the Iliad was Homer's thinking, externalized. Writing and then printing took that mental construct and it recorded it on paper. Slipboxes cut that long scroll of thought up into blocks that could then be shuffled and manipulated discreetly. Obsidian and Rome allow us to see the branches and almost to keep the two views of the Necker cube in our heads simultaneously, like one of Peter Watts's vampires in Blind Sight and Ecopraxia. Ahrens stresses the temporal nature of our knowledge, pointing out that our ideas are bound to change and dependent on the development of our understanding. So in this sense, any choices that we make about where an idea fits into the larger structure is mostly relevant for the question that we're currently working on. The same idea or the same fact or the same note may serve another purpose in another inquiry at another time. In this way, the system maintains its flexibility. Ahrens distinguishes between the thought processes of an archivist and those of a writer. The writer, he says, is looking, in his words, for already existing lines of thought to append new ideas onto. Keywords and tags generally relate to the topics that you're already pursuing, rather than being generated exclusively by the contents of the note. I suspect for me, there's an element of both. I imagine in his example of the paraphrase from Thomas Kuhn, where he says, a sudden increase of ad hoc theories is a sign that a normal science phase might be in crisis. I suspect that that note would also lead me to tag the note paradigm shift, even though those words, that phrase, is not included in the note. I might also tag it paradigm shift even if I was not already pursuing a train of thought about paradigms, because I may in the future. And that is something that I find interesting. So this is an ideal example, I think, of how to paraphrase a point in a text, how to cite it, and then how to create a tag that will make it relevant in a future in which we might return to the topic. Ahrens also gives a more complicated example of this effect when he suggests that Niklas Luhmann's very complex descriptions of social structures, such as money, power, love, truth, and justice, that he said served different needs in different parts of society, that these were based on and they were made possible by the slipbox. Ahrens says, observations like these could never be done nor explained by someone who is working with a system that keeps things neatly separated by preconceived themes and topics. And he may be right. But what happens, Ahrens asks, when you bring a great new idea to your slipbox and you find out that it's already in there? And then you find out that it isn't even original. Someone else had the thought before you. And he goes on to suggest that without a system, we can find ourselves rediscovering information. Or rather, actually, we won't find ourselves doing that because each time it will feel like we're making the discovery anew. Ahrens also says that it's much easier to see the differences and similarities between ideas when they're in written form than it is to just think about them as ideas in your head, because they tend to come serially, one after another, rather than in parallel. That's why we typically use the words comparing notes for this process. More subtly, the slipbox also helps us to treat older information on a kind of an equal weighting with new, fresh ideas that may seem more attractive because they're more easily available to us. And this he calls the feature positive effect. So turning all of these ideas into notes sort of equalizes their statuses. Although this system building is taking place outside our heads in our so-called second brains, Ahrens says that the web of mental connections that we make in the slipbox or in a vault is mirrored, at least a little bit, in our minds. He claims we co-evolve with our slipboxes. We build the same connections in our heads while we deliberately develop them in our slipbox. My reading on retrieval practice suggests that this is true, at least to a degree, and to whatever degree it works, that's a benefit. Ahrens then moves on to the idea of creativity. He begins by suggesting that experience and intimacy with your tools is what helps us to make intuitive leaps to insights. This is something akin to the 10,000 hour rule. But based on his previous research for a book that he published in 2014, Ahrens says that intuition is actually a form of unconscious rationality, where our minds work out a problem kind of without our awareness. Often, he says, this behind-the-scenes work is on the basis of comparison, and it happens by incremental shifts rather than by way of groundbreaking new ideas. And to be able to play with ideas, he says, we first have to liberate them from their original context by means of abstraction and re-specification. He then describes some things to keep in mind when we're making notes. We're abstracting from authors' thoughts to our own, after all. So it's important to make sure that we really understood what we read, rather than just fitting it into our preconceptions. That would be confirmation bias. To be able to see what we see instead of what we expect to see is indeed a skill in itself, Ahrens says. Then we should also be concerned that the evidence that we have found isn't subject to availability or survivorship biases, asking ourselves if there isn't something that is not in the picture but could be relevant, as Ahrens says. In addition to trying to ask counterfactual questions, he concludes, the first question should always be directed towards the question itself. What kind of answer can you expect from asking a question in this particular way? What is missing? And that's good advice. Ahrens ends the chapter by suggesting that the restrictions imposed by the slipbox are good for our thought process and should be embraced. The major one is the one that Andy Matuszak calls atomicity. Ahrens says that despite the incredible amount of storage we now have, we should write our notes like note cards. We should write the digital note as if space were limited. And we should restrict ourselves to just one idea per note and force ourselves to be as precise and as brief as possible. And I think I can agree with this idea without embracing Ahrens' elaboration that all real creativity comes from restrictions like the haiku and that freedom is found in structure. So I'll have more to say about the last couple of chapters in the next video. But that has been my reaction to chapter 12. So I hope people found that a little bit interesting. Thanks very much for listening, and I will see you again